Picture this. You are standing in a stone archive in Istanbul in the year 1513. In your hands is a piece of parchment gazelle skin stitched together from older fragments, each one copied from a source that no longer exists. And what it shows makes your hands shake. A continent at the bottom of the world, coastlines that no European sailor had ever seen, mountains beneath ice that would not be confirmed until the age of satellites. The man who drew it was not a prophet. He was not a mystic. He was an admiral, and the sources he used, the ones he named himself, came from a world that history says should not have existed. For centuries, the story of Antarctica was simple and clean. The southern continent was discovered by accident, by sailors pushing further than anyone had pushed before in the decade between 1820 and 1830. A Russian expedition led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, an American sealer named Nathaniel Palmer, a British naval officer, Edward Bransfield. 3 separate voyages, almost simultaneous, each catching the first glimpse of that white wall rising out of the Southern Ocean. It was a genuine discovery, a continent no human eye had ever catalogued, no human hand had ever mapped, no civilization had ever reached, or so the accepted history tells us. From that point forward, Antarctica became one of the defining projects of the age of exploration, the most extreme environment on Earth. A continent larger than Europe buried under an ice sheet that in places reaches 4 kilometers deep. Explorers raced to reach its interior through the early 1900s. Amundsen reached the South Pole in 1911. Scott followed a month later and did not return. The continent claimed lives with a patience that felt almost intentional by the time of the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958. That science had finally built the tools to map what lay beneath the ice: seismic survey equipment, aerial radar, instruments that could read the shape of the bedrock buried under millions of years of accumulated snow and cold. The maps that emerged from that effort, the maps of subglacial Antarctica, the continent beneath the continent, were a genuine revelation. Ranges of mountains, lake systems sealed from sunlight, a terrain as varied and dramatic as any on Earth's surface, is hidden from all human knowledge beneath the deepest ice on the planet. According to mainstream cartographic history, that subglacial terrain was entirely unknown before the instruments of the mid-20th century revealed it. The shape of the Antarctic coastline without its ice, the actual geological edge of the land, was simply not information any civilization could have possessed. There was no way to know it. There was no tool to see through kilometers of ice. The knowledge did not exist. Now, that is what every standard history says, and for the most part, the people who wrote those histories had no particular reason to look more carefully. The discovery timeline was well documented. The explorers were named. The dates were recorded. The story was complete. But there was one thing no one stopped to question. Well, one object sitting in a museum collection in Istanbul that should have broken the entire framework wide open, and instead was quietly filed under interesting anomaly and placed at the back of a drawer, an object drawn in ink on parchment, signed by an Ottoman admiral in 1513, carrying at its southern edge a coastline that should have been invisible to anyone alive in that century. And in its margins, in the admiral's own handwriting, as a note that changes everything, the source maps he used were ancient. Some of them, he wrote, came from the time of Alexander the Great. Others came from sources whose origin even he did not fully know. What if the discovery of Antarctica was not a discovery at all? What if it was a rediscovery, and the original knowledge was so old that the civilization that produced it has been entirely forgotten? His name was Piri Reis. Born around 1470, yet he became one of the most accomplished naval commanders in the history of the Ottoman Empire, a man who had studied the Mediterranean, charted the Aegean, and commanded fleets in battles that would be remembered for centuries. He was also, by the standards of his age, an extraordinary cartographer. In 1513, he compiled a world map from dozens of source documents, charts, portolans, and older maps he had gathered from across the Mediterranean world, and some of them seized from Portuguese and Spanish ships, some acquired through trade and diplomacy, some of unknown origin. He dated the map, signed it, annotated it with his own observations, and presented it to the Ottoman Sultan. The map survived, most of it. What remains is the western portion, the Atlantic, the Americas, the coasts of Europe and Africa, and at the bottom edge of the surviving fragment, beneath the known world, there is a landmass. A continuous southern landmass with a detailed, specific coastline stretching along the bottom of the map. For centuries, historians assumed this was a theoretical construction. Medieval and Renaissance cartographers had long speculated about a great southern continent, a terra australis incognita, an unknown southern land, to balance the landmasses of the northern hemisphere. The assumption was logical, symmetrical, philosophically tidy. But most scholars assume Piri Reis had simply incorporated this conventional theoretical feature, drawn from imagination and speculation, into his map. That interpretation held for 400 years, until 1960. In 1960, a cartographer and military historian named Charles Hapgood published a detailed technical analysis of the Piri Reis Map in which he compared its southern coastline not to the ice-covered edge of Antarctica as it appears today, but to the subglacial topography confirmed by the seismic surveys of the International Geophysical Year just 3 years earlier, the maps of Antarctica's bedrock, the shape of the continent without its ice. Yet the correspondence was precise enough to stop the analysis cold. Specific bays that do not appear on the ice surface map of Antarctica appeared on the Piri Reis Map. A large peninsula in the map's southern section corresponded to a subglacial feature confirmed by modern radar that sits under several hundred meters of ice and is invisible from the surface. Yet a mountain range along the interior edge of the map's southern coastline matched the elevation contours of a subglacial ridge that no survey tool could have detected before the 1950s. These were not the vague similarities that pattern-seeking minds impose on ambiguous shapes. They were specific, localized correspondences between a 500-year-old map and geological data that was, at the time Piri Reis drew his map, yet buried under a sheet of ice that had been accumulating for millions of years. The official response from mainstream cartographic scholarship was cautious. Some researchers acknowledged the correspondences were striking. Others argued the map's projections were too uncertain, that converting its coordinates into modern equivalents introduced too much margin of error to draw firm conclusions. Others pointed to the theoretical southern continent tradition and argued that Piri Reis had simply produced a particularly lucky guess. But here is what that explanation does not address. Lucky guesses do not produce bathymetric detail. Lucky guesses do not generate specific subglacial peninsulas and interior ridgelines that match features confirmed by radar survey. The theoretical terra australis of Renaissance cartography was a smooth, symmetrical, so featureless landmass, the product of philosophical reasoning, not observation. What appears on the Piri Reis map is not smooth or featureless. It is irregular, specific, and detailed in ways that no cartographer drawing from imagination would have reason to include. And then there is what Piri Reis himself wrote in the margins. He did not claim the southern section was theoretical. He did not describe it as a conventional geographical element. Yet he described it as derived from source maps of confirmed antiquity. Maps that, in his own words, came from sources whose full history he could not trace. What was in those source maps? Who drew them, and when, and from what vantage point did they map a coastline buried under ice that had been building since before the first human city was founded? The first thing to understand about the Piri Reis map is how accurate it is in the areas where accuracy can be verified, because that accuracy is what makes the southern section so impossible to dismiss. The map's rendering of the west coast of Africa and the east coast of South America matches modern cartography with a precision that was not achievable using the navigation tools of 1513. Yet the longitude error across the Atlantic, the most technically difficult measurement in pre-chronometer navigation, is remarkably small. Longitude requires knowing exact time, and exact portable timekeeping would not be invented for another 250 years. Yet the map's Atlantic proportions are correct to within a margin that no single voyage or set of voyages using sand timers and dead reckoning could reliably produce. Yes, cartographic historians have proposed that Piri Reis assembled multiple charts from different voyages, each with its own errors, and that those errors partially canceled each other in the compilation process. This is a reasonable hypothesis. It is also the kindest possible explanation for a map that, by the standards of its era, simply should not be as accurate as it is. Here is the layer beneath that explanation. If the map's accuracy in the Atlantic reflects a compilation of source charts from multiple independent voyages, a kind of accumulated triangulation, then the same principle must apply to the southern section. The detail in the southern coastline is not the work of a single guessing cartographer. It reflects the same compilation methodology. It reflects source charts that, by the map's own internal logic, were themselves the product of survey voyages. Voyages that saw the coastline being depicted. Think about what that actually means. To compile an accurate chart from multiple sources, you need multiple sources that are themselves accurate. Accuracy comes from observation. Observation requires presence. For the southern section to be drawn with the specificity it shows, the bays, the peninsula, the interior ridge, someone had to be there. Someone had to be in Antarctic waters with instruments sufficient to map what they were seeing. As at a time when the coastline was visible because the ice had not yet covered it, and the level of ice coverage implied by the coastline's position suggests that this occurred no less than 6,000 years ago. Most people never get told this part. The conclusion is that simple. It is also that enormous. Piri Reis was not working in isolation. He was the inheritor of a cartographic tradition that stretched back through the Mediterranean world across more than 1,000 years. When he wrote, yet in his marginal notes, that his source maps came from the era of Alexander the Great, and before, he was not claiming divine inspiration or personal brilliance. He was describing a process of transmission, a chain of copied and recopied charts whose original authors he could no longer identify. This tradition of ancient source maps is known to historians. The geographer Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, it compiled a world geography that drew on earlier surveys, whose origin even he described as ancient. The Roman admiral Marinus of Tyre, whose work Ptolemy relied upon, was himself working from older source material. Strabo, writing a century before Ptolemy, referenced geographical knowledge he attributed to sources stretching back to the time of Homer. The chain of transmission is real and documented. What is not documented, what remains a gap at the foundation of everything, is where the chain begins. Who made the original surveys? In what era were coastlines being systematically mapped at a level of accuracy sufficient to survive through copying after copying after copying into the age of Ptolemy and eventually into the age of Piri Reis? The Library of Alexandria, before its destruction, is known to have contained geographical works attributed to scholars of extreme antiquity, works whose originals have never been recovered. Among those works were references to surveys of the Southern Ocean, not mythological narratives of the Deep South, but navigational and geographical descriptions. The references survive only in quotations within surviving texts, fragments of fragments, echoes of things that were once complete. But they suggest a body of Southern Ocean geographical knowledge that predates the classical world. And that was only the beginning. The Piri Reis Map is not the only example. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows Antarctica as a continent with river systems, rivers that would require a land surface free of ice. The Mercator World Map of 1569, compiled by one of the most rigorous cartographers in history, includes a southern continent whose inland features do not correspond to any later exploratory data, but do suggest an ice-free terrain. The Boache Map of 1737, produced more than 80 years before official Antarctic discovery, shows the continent divided into two land masses separated by a sea channel, a feature that was not confirmed until modern sonar mapped the subglacial topography and found exactly such a channel beneath the ice. In each case, the cartographer cited older sources. In each case, the sources cannot be traced to any known civilization. Can this really be random? 5 separate maps. It's produced by 5 different cartographers in 4 different centuries, all showing an Antarctic coastline that should have been invisible, all citing ancient source material, all containing specific features confirmed only by modern survey technology. The probability of coincidence collapses when you look at the sequence as a whole. Antarctica's ice is a library. Each layer of ice, Each annual snowfall, compressed into the sheet below, contains trapped air bubbles, pollen grains, volcanic ash, and chemical signatures that tell the story of the climate in the year that snowfall landed. Ice cores drilled from the Antarctic sheet now provide a continuous climate record stretching back 800,000 years. It is one of the most complete natural archives in the science of paleoclimatology. What that archive confirms is this: Antarctica has not been uniformly or continuously glaciated. There have been periods, long periods, and measured in thousands of years, when portions of the Antarctic coastline were substantially less ice-covered than they are today. The most recent of these periods, corresponding to the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, saw global sea levels rise dramatically as ice sheets across the northern hemisphere melted. During that same transition period, some Antarctic coastal regions experienced reduced ice coverage as the climate shifted. Pollen samples extracted from Antarctic sediment cores confirm vegetation at coastal sites as recently as this period. Not forests, but tundra vegetation. Ground cover, a coastal environment at the edge of habitable, the kind of environment that, in the northern hemisphere, supported early human settlement. The kind of coastline that, if seen by a sophisticated maritime civilization navigating the Southern Ocean during that window, could have been surveyed and mapped. 6,000 years ago is not impossibly ancient in terms of human civilization. The Sumerians were building city-states. The Egyptians were beginning the pre-dynastic period that would lead to the pharaonic civilization. The Indus Valley civilization was taking its earliest form. Something was clearly happening in the human world in terms of organized complexity. The conventional assumption is that this complexity was confined to the river valleys of the Middle East and Asia. But maritime civilization leaves a different kind of record than agricultural civilization. Farmers leave ruins. Sailors leave knowledge, navigational knowledge, geographical knowledge, the accumulated intelligence of routes and coastlines passed down in charts and pilot books and oral tradition. If a maritime civilization of sufficient sophistication was operating in the Southern Ocean 6,000 years ago, it would not necessarily have left ruins that archaeology has found. It would have left its knowledge, encoded in charts, passed through the chain of transmission that ends 500 years ago, in the hands of an Ottoman admiral on a cold morning in Istanbul. In the 1960s and 70s, Charles Hapgood and his collaborators conducted a detailed mathematical analysis of the Piri Reis Map's projection, the geometric system underlying how the map converts the curved surface of the Earth into a flat drawing. What they found was extraordinary. But the map's projection, when analyzed, appears to use a center point located not in the Mediterranean world, not in Alexandria or Cairo or Istanbul, but in the South Atlantic near the equator, a point that has no obvious significance from the perspective of any known civilization in the ancient or medieval world. A point that does, however, correspond precisely to an equidistant projection centered on Antarctica itself. Now, this is the kind of mathematical signature that surveyors leave in their work. If you are mapping from a central point, the geometry of your projection encodes that center. The analysis suggests that the original survey from which the Piri Reis Map's southern section derives was conducted from or centered on Antarctica, not Europe, not North Africa, not any of the civilizations whose geographical traditions we can trace. A survey centered on Antarctica, precise enough to capture subglacial features, mathematical enough to use a proper spherical projection. That is not the work of a primitive maritime culture making opportunistic voyages into unknown waters. That is the work of a civilization with a systematic understanding of global geography, with instruments capable of precise longitudinal measurement, and with a reason to be in Antarctic waters comprehensive enough to sustain a detailed survey effort. You don't think that is a coincidence, do you? The mathematics embedded in the map points back to a civilization whose identity the map does not reveal, whose ruins no one has found, whose name, if it had one, has been lost for longer than any civilization that survived has been keeping records. The Piri Reis Map does not stand alone in implying ancient knowledge of the southern world. It is scattered across the oldest surviving literature of multiple unconnected civilizations are references to a knowledge of the Deep South that should not exist. In the ancient Sanskrit texts of India, there are geographical descriptions of a southern continent, called Jambudvipa in some accounts, described not as a mythological realm, but as a physical land accessible by sea, characterized by extreme cold and unusual natural phenomena. The descriptions are embedded in passages that also contain accurate geographical information about the Indian subcontinent and the Southeast Asian archipelago, suggesting that the southern references are of the same observational character as the information that can be verified. Among the ancient Polynesian navigational traditions, oral records of extraordinary precision that allowed seafaring across the entire Pacific without instruments, there are references to a great cold land to the south, a place of ice and perpetual twilight that the most skilled navigators knew the bearing to but were forbidden by tradition to approach. The prohibition itself suggests experience, not rumor. Yet you do not create a prohibition against approaching a place that no one has ever reached. In the medieval Islamic geographical tradition, scholars working from classical sources describe a southern ocean with specific navigational characteristics, currents, winds, storm patterns, that match the actual southern ocean around Antarctica. These descriptions appear in works citing earlier Greek and Persian sources, which themselves cite still earlier Babylonian and Egyptian navigational records. None of these traditions identifies the source of their southern knowledge. None of them claims direct observation. They describe what was passed to them through the chain of received learning, the accumulated inheritance of geographical intelligence from an era they could name only vaguely as the ancients. Multiple unconnected civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, all pointing in the same direction at the bottom of the world, all describing it in terms that suggest it was real, so observed, and specifically known. Pillar 6. What was deliberately not followed. In 1960, when Hapgood's analysis of the Piri Reis Map first circulated in academic circles, it generated genuine discussion. A letter of support came from an unexpected quarter, the Cartography unit of the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command. A colonel named Harold Ohlmeyer wrote formally to Hapgood confirming that his team's analysis of the map's southern coastline and its correspondence with subglacial Antarctic topography was, in the Air Force cartographer's professional judgment, accurate. This letter exists. It has been reproduced in multiple publications. Shows the Air Force letter is significant not because of what an Air Force has to do with ancient maps, but because the correspondence it confirms is being validated by professionals with no stake in the conclusion using modern cartographic methodology. The SAC cartography team were not ancient mystery enthusiasts. They were military professionals evaluating the technical accuracy of a document, and their evaluation confirmed the correspondence. What did not follow was any sustained institutional engagement with the question. No major university funded a systematic analysis of all the early modern maps showing Antarctic features and their relationship to confirmed subglacial topography. No archaeology or classics program mounted a serious investigation of the ancient source map tradition described by Ptolemy, Piri Reis, and others. The question generated a brief pulse of interest and then subsided. Not because it was disproven, but because it proved too large for any single discipline to contain and too radical for any single institution to take on. Most people never get told this part. The evidence was examined by credentialed professionals. The correspondence was confirmed, and then the question was simply not followed, not refuted, not absorbed into the mainstream understanding. Just set aside quietly, in the way that the most inconvenient questions tend to be set aside, not with a no, but with a silence that accumulates until it looks like consensus. And nothing prepared researchers for what a serious cross-disciplinary analysis might actually reveal, because no such analysis has ever been fully funded or completed. The question waits. The maps are in public collections, and the bedrock topography they correspond to has been confirmed by satellite and radar and drill core. All that is missing is the will to put those facts in the same room and ask, seriously, yet what they mean together. Set down the evidence for a moment. Set down the maps and the ice cores and the mathematical projections. Because what all of this points toward is not simply a question about who drew a particular map in 1513. It points toward the oldest and most unsettling question in the human story. Who were we before the history we remember? The standard narrative of civilization rests on a premise so deeply embedded that most people never think to question it. You see, the premise is that we were first simple and then we became complex. That knowledge accumulates in a single direction, that the civilization we have now is the most sophisticated one that has ever existed on this planet, because every civilization before it was, by definition, earlier in the sequence and therefore less advanced. The arrow points forward. The past is primitive. The present is the peak. But what happens to that premise when a map survives that shows knowledge no one in that era should have had? What happens when that map is not alone? When there are 5 maps from 5 different cartographers all showing the same thing? What happens when the mathematical geometry embedded in those maps points to a civilization centered in Antarctica using instruments we cannot account for? Conducting surveys that required a level of global geographical understanding that the official timeline of human knowledge does not accommodate? The premise breaks. Not at the edges, at the foundation. Consider what this means for human history as a whole. If a maritime civilization of sufficient sophistication to conduct systematic global surveys existed 6,000 to 12,000 years ago and was then destroyed or declined, or was overwhelmed by the catastrophic sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, then the history we have inherited is not the beginning of the story. It is a continuation, a recovery. The river valley civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley, the civilizations we call the cradle of humanity, they may have been not the origin of organized knowledge, but the heirs of something older, rebuilding from fragments of a tradition they only partially understood. And the maps were fragments. The astronomical records were fragments. The mathematical relationships embedded in ancient monument alignments were fragments, all pointing back to something before them. And here is the second angle, the one that reaches past history and touches something more personal. The people who surveyed the Antarctic coastline, the people who produced the knowledge that arrived through a chain of copying and transmission. But in the hands of Piri Reis, those people were human beings. Their DNA was the same as yours. Their brains worked by the same biological logic. Their children were born with the same capacity for language, for mathematics, for the abstract reasoning that makes cartography possible. Whatever they knew, they learned. Whatever they built with the same biological equipment that built every other civilization that has ever existed on this planet, which means this knowledge is not alien. But it is not supernatural. It is not beyond the capacity of human intelligence to have produced or to recover. It is human knowledge of human origin, passed down through human hands, and then lost through catastrophe or time, or the slow entropy of civilizations that do not survive long enough to see what they have built become common understanding. The knowledge is in the chain of transmission that produced the map. And the map is in a museum in Istanbul, in public collections. It's accessible to anyone who wants to look. The evidence is not hidden. It is hiding in plain sight, in the place that all the most important truths tend to hide, directly in front of us, waiting for the question we have not yet been willing to ask seriously. Maybe the story of humanity is not a line moving forward. Maybe it is a circle, turning slowly, civilizations rising and falling and rising again, each time inheriting fragments of the one before. And maybe the most important fragment, the one that tells us most clearly who we were at our fullest, is drawn on a piece of gazelle skin in the archives of a palace in Istanbul, showing a coastline at the bottom of the world that was not supposed to be there. This is not ancient history in the sense of something finished and irrelevant. This is origin. This is in us, in the biological and cultural inheritance that every human being carries without knowing they carry it. The capacity for the kind of knowledge the map implies did not disappear when the civilization that produced it disappeared. It went underground, into the chain of transmission, into the fragments that survived, into you. So where does that leave us? A map drawn in 1513 shows specific features of a continent buried under ice, features confirmed only by 20th century technology. Its own creator says it was copied from sources he could not fully trace. These 5 separate cartographers across 4 centuries show the same continent, the same specific details, citing the same lost antiquity. The mathematics embedded in the projection points to a civilization centered in Antarctica, surveying with instruments we cannot explain, at a time when the Antarctic coast was last visible to human eyes. What do you believe? Was this the greatest coincidence in the history of cartography? Or was there a civilization sophisticated enough to map the world from its most remote corner, that vanished so completely it left only shadows in the maps of people who copied its work without knowing what they were copying? Share your theory below, because if this story opened something in you, well, our exploration of the pre-flood world and the civilizations that preceded recorded history will carry this question into even deeper territory. If this resonated, a thumbs up and a subscription help other truth seekers find their way here. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.